Hello, everybody. We are on our last lecture for my favorite section, social culture anthropology. This is a continuation from last time we talked about when we went over Diablo and Adam's videos. We're going to recap that in a second, but real quickly, again, the formatting for the midterm exam is 20 questions, multiple choice, 4 questions that are short answer, 90 minutes, which is one attempt. For the short answer portion, make sure you are really spending time on that. If you'll notice, there are only 4 of them, and they're each 2.5 points each, okay? Multiple choice is half a point each, so please, please, please make sure you have enough time when you're doing your short answer questions. You have 90 minutes to do it, which means basically a class period to get it done, okay? The way that I would recommend studying is to look for the answers in the PowerPoints first, okay? And then when you're done doing that, let's say you have some questions, look it up in the lecture. And then if you have some more questions, you can always ask me. Okay, there will be a light review that is posted, so just keep paying attention to the bright space pages for that. Okay, all right. Moving on. So what is so sorry. Um, when we're talking about gender and sexuality, I need you to understand that cultural anthropologists spend like their whole academic careers like studying one part of this. So I'm just kind of giving you a fun introduction. This is by no means the complete entirety of gender and sexuality, but I do think it is an interesting aspect of it. Okay, and the same thing with ethnicity, race, and nationality. There are people that spend their whole entire careers on this, like over 10, 20 years on this. Us talking about it in a couple hours is not really going to cover everything, but I do try to make this class a little more interesting. So we try to cover interesting and kind of topical issues. Okay, so before we get into it, let's talk about sex and gender. Okay, so sex is the biological makeup of a male or female, and gender is the cultural assignment of being a man or a woman. So things that are quote unquote natural of one sex, and this can go deeper in anthropology. Even the definitions of sex are kind of they are cultural, right? But for this particular lesson, let's get a little deeper, or let's not go so deep. Okay, so what is natural of one sex? Remember we talked about natural from social culture anthropology. What is the difference between something that is natural, something that is cultural? Very easily, natural something that is biologically passed on, and something cultural something that you learn, right? So what is something that is biological of someone's sex, right? Things such as reproductive parts, right? Penis, vagina, the mammary glands, the having a uterus. These are all important aspects, but there are also other things, right? Other physical things, such as men have more upper body strength. Women have a extra layer of fat, I believe, for childbearing. Women have wider hips for childbearing. Um, yeah. So these are all kind of like biological things of sex, right? But what is something that is cultural of gender, right? Or in this case, sex as well, right? So things like, pink being a feminine color is very much cultural, right? More traditional ideas of like, more traditional roles of what people should do, like only men can be construction workers, or sorry, men should be construction workers. Only women should be playing volleyball. Only men should be, or men should fix things in the house. Men should, ask people out on the first date. Women should have long hair. Women should only be wearing a dress, whatever. These are all different cultural associations of sex. Okay, so this is very important. The difference between sex and gender is that sex is the biological determination of what male and female is, and gender is the cultural assignment of being a man or a woman. Okay. So we're going to start off with this Judith Butler video. Again, if this is unclear in the lecture, please make sure to watch this on your own time. It's not a super long video, so it shouldn't be too bad. Let me share this bad boy. All right, should be good. Oh wait, nope. You know what? I guarantee you the where's the there we go. Okay. All right. So shut off my camera. I'm gonna silence myself, and then we will talk about this.
It's one thing to say that gender is performed, and that's a little different from saying gender is performative. When we say gender is performed, we usually mean that we've taken on a role, we're acting in some way, and that our acting or our role playing is crucial to the gender that we are and the gender that we present to the world. To say that gender is performative is a little different because for something to be performative means that it produces a series of effects. We act and walk and speak and talk in ways that consolidate an impression of being a man or being a woman. You know, I was walking down the street in Berkeley when I first arrived several years ago, and a young woman who was, I think, in high school leaned out of her window and she yelled, "Are you a lesbian?" And, and she was looking to harass me. Or maybe she was just freaked out, or she thought I looked like I probably was one and wanted to know. But instead, I just turned around and I said, "Yes, I am." And that really shocked her. We act as if that being of a man or that being of a woman is actually an internal reality or something that's simply true about us, a fact about us. Actually, it's a phenomenon that's being produced all the time and reproduced all the time. So to say gender is performative is to say that nobody really is a gender from the start. I know it's controversial, but that's my claim. Think about how
Sorry, let me make sure everything's good. Yeah, so again, like if you can't hear the stuff, just make sure to um watch it on your own time.
difficult it is for sissy boys, or how difficult it is for tomboys to function socially without being bullied, or without being teased, or without sometimes suffering threats of violence, or without their parents intervening to say, maybe you need a psychiatrist, or why can't you be normal? So, you know, there are institutional powers like psychiatric normalization, and there are informal kinds of practices like bullying, which try to keep us in our gendered place. There's a real question for me about how such gender norms get established and policed, and what the best way is to disrupt them and to overcome the police function. It's my view that gender is culturally formed, but it's also a domain of agency or freedom. It's most important to resist the violence that is imposed by ideal gender norms, especially against those who are gender different, who are non-conforming in their gender presentation.
Okay, so let's go back to this one. Why is sharing paused? Okay. Great. Okay. So, okay. So there's a couple key points here, right? The first thing I really want you to pay attention to. Oh, wait, am I showing up? It says I'm showing up, so I'm assuming it's showing up. Okay. One of the key points here is that this understanding of performative. So the reason why this is important, right, is because when Judith Butler talks about gender, right, she mentions a few things. The first thing is that gender is cultural. You have to keep in mind Judith Butler is not an anthropologist. Judith Butler is actually a philosopher. Okay, so um and she and they were, you know, or I guess technically it's they now, but in the past she was responsible for a lot of the kind of foundational theory for like gender studies and stuff like that. But that's besides the point. So the first thing is, you know, gender is definitely not something you are born with. You are not coming out of the womb screaming, "I like to play with trucks" or "I like to play with Barbies," right? So that, in terms of anthropology, is nothing super different or new. However, this thing that she talks about, which is the notion of performing or being performative, is very important. So when you think of performing, the reason why she had to clarify is because performing is something like if you were singing for a play. If you are singing for a play, you are actively using your voice to project and do certain things with your voice to sing. Okay. However, performative is a little bit different because, especially in terms of gender, we don't actively say, "Hey, I'm a man and I do this," or "Hey, I'm a woman and I do this." It is a little bit less conscious. It's less like in the front of your brain. For example, when you are getting ready for something, you need to look nice, right? You look in the mirror and you say, "This looks nice. This looks cute. This looks whatever, handsome," whatever words you want to use. You do not say to yourself, "Hey, this looks really womanly," or "Hey, this looks really manly." Those are not the things. Now, while they might play into what you find to be good or bad clothing, the key point though is that it's not as conscious, right? Even for example, me, when I'm like, I really need to use the restroom, I look at the thing and it says, man, I walk in there. I don't think I'm a man. I just think that, hey, this is where I belong. I need to use the bathroom, get out of my way, right? So that's the difference there between performative. Performative is a little bit less conscious in terms of um, doing those things with gender, okay? So Judith Butler here argues that gender is something that people accomplish through a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame. This congeals over time to produce this appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. So what's really important about this, I do not know why there's not a, I don't know why there's not a, let's call it of me, like a, shouldn't there be like a little, little, uh, general, is it this one? Um, oh yeah, see it is, yeah, what's up, dude? Well, it's fine. So anyways, let's talk about this line by line. This is a very complicated quote, but it is very important, right? Arguing that gender is something people accomplish through a set of repeated acts. So that's the first thing is very straightforward. So Judith, this is saying that Judith Butler here is saying that gender is something that people accomplish, like it's something that they do. It's not something that you're inherited with, right? By doing things over and over again, repeated acts, right? Now, this next line, within a highly rigid regulatory frame. Okay, so in this case, rigid regulatory frame is just referring to society. Now, what does this actually mean? It's basically a space where you are encouraged and discouraged, or sorry, encouraged to follow certain types of norms and discouraged from following or not following these kinds of norms. So, for example, right, what this basically means is that there are certain things that um, will enforce the rules, right? So, for example, if we're talking about gender, I see this all the time in the little kids' classrooms. They a boy will pull out a pink folder, and then the other boys will make fun of him and say he's gay, right? Because men or boys are not supposed to like or have things that are the color pink, they are reinforcing or regulating what boys should do by making fun of someone that has a certain type of folder. While on the other side of that, if a boy took out a Spider-Man folder, they might be like, "Oh wow, that photo's so cool." That is another example of how, in this case, the classroom or this group of boys regulate the rules within their little group, right? But if that's a little too complicated, don't worry about it. In this particular case, what this means is society, right? Because when you act different from what society expects of you, which is like, again, like, I don't know, men with long hair or men with colored nails or whatever, there are certain penalties or consequences that come with that. And they're not necessarily that intense, but they will affect the way you behave, and they are there to again, unintentionally, maybe move you towards doing different types of things. Okay, so highly rigid regulatory frame means society. Congeals over time to reduce the appearance of substance of a natural sort of being. What that really means is, if you guys have ever like made Jello, you know, the powder, you mix it up with water or whatever and put it in the fridge and it becomes solid. Or if you cook, if you make like a stew and you put it in the fridge and you see all the fat like get hard on the top, that is congealing. Okay, so it comes together and produce it's some like hard. So basically, these things, these repeated acts that happen within society come together over time to make it seem like these things are biologically passed on, that they're natural, but in reality, they are cultural. Okay. So things, and this is I think this is really the best example. Actually, let me give the whole quote all together, all at once, one more time. Judith Butler argues that gender is something that people do by doing things over and over again within society that comes together over time to make it seem like gender is biological or natural, but in reality, it is cultural. Okay. So let me give you a perfect example of this, right? When there's a little kid, I was teaching this little kid and he was a boy and he was, I think he was in kindergarten, maybe in preschool. And the boy legitimately thought all girls were born with long hair, right? And this is a great example because in his life, the whatever 20 women or girls that he's seen have long hair, right? And so if you look at that example, okay, his understanding of being a girl or a woman, right, is set by a bunch of repeated acts, which is what? Which is him seeing other girls or women with long hair within his whatever, within his world, within society, right? Maybe his family, his classroom, whatever. And because he's seen so many of them, they come together over time to make it seem like a woman having long hair is natural. But in reality, you know, it's cultural, right? Everyone has short hair when they're born and it grows long. Okay. And this applies to how we understand gender as well, right? We are born and raised with a certain way that men act or that women act or that people who aren't men or women act, you know, and that creates the standard for what those people are. Okay. And this happens a lot of times, you know, more extreme versions. I'm sure, well, actually, maybe this generation, maybe not so much because you guys' parents are probably not that old. But if you go back in time a little bit, you know, like even things like, oh, you know, no wife of mine is going to be working because that was a big thing. At least to our generation, I think woman working is a good thing and important and an essential thing, right? Not to say it's always good or bad, but it is something that is not uncommon for me. It is because at that time, from that time period, people only saw men working, and people who maybe had women working were really struggling family wise, or maybe reflected poorly on the family, whatever it is. It sets a certain standard because of the things you see over and over again, right? But the problem is here, right? Oh, sorry, not the problem, but the interesting thing here is that this last sentence, right? It makes it seem like it's natural, but in reality it's cultural. That is a key point, right? Because when you, for example, if you've been around women and they all wear a certain type of sweater, and all of a sudden you see a woman that doesn't wear that type of sweater, it's going to confuse you. Obviously, that's an easy example. But when you know, like a lot of people that, well, if you already watched the video, a lot of people that see people that are gender neutral or that are trans feel uncomfortable with the way they dress or the way they appear or the way they speak, but that's simply because we were not familiar with the way that they speak. If a bunch of people spoke that way, it wouldn't be a big deal. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, Judith Butler is arguing that gender is something that people do by doing things over and over again within society that comes together over time to make it seem like it's natural, but in reality, it is cultural. Okay. Now, again, two essential points here, right? First one is that gender is cultural, right? We've established this a long time ago, but again, I wanted to emphasize it for this particular class. And then gender is created through the repeated acts and is appears natural after being repeated so often, right? And so the example here is the kid. Okay, The kid who believes that all girls and all women have long hair because all the girls and women in his life have long hair. Very simple. Okay. So this is very important. Now, let's see. So yeah, okay. So this is the last thing. We don't have this reading anymore because it was a little bit too difficult for the class, but there are a couple of things that are very interesting here. So how do you know that gender is cultural, right? Well, according to this person's ethnography, which is very good, by the way, they studied the formation of masculinity and femininity in high schools. You don't even know that much about it, but basically they talked about the different words they used, how the high schools are feeling out like what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, and stuff like that. But how you know that gender is cultural is because masculinity or femininity or sexuality and gender in general don't have a set definition. There's no set definition for them, right? You go from culture to culture, yeah, there might be similarities, but they're not the same, actually. Very, very different. And that's why there's a lot of judgments from there's a lot of ethnocentrism in understanding other cultures under definition of what a man is or what a woman is, so on and so forth, right? So, you know, that is a very very clear demonstration that gender is cultural. Okay. And of course, these gender roles are affected by our day-to-day environments. In this particular research, it's affected by the conversations that we have in high school. It's affected by the way that adulthood is viewed in America. Basically, after graduating high school, you're an adult. In particular, they had like those senior pep rally things. You know, that had like, you know, the girls doing a certain thing and the men doing a certain thing. The men had to be like masculine and save the girls from being mugged, so on and so forth, right? And not to mention other things like prom and dance and you know, fall ball or whatever you guys used to call it. Anyways, in the art or in the book, the author concludes by suggesting that clothes tend to be sexuality highlights masculinity as a process rather than a social identity associated with specific bodies. So that's just a fancy way of saying that, you know, if you look at it from any angle, especially in high school, where that kind of the understanding of what it is to be a man or a woman is explored, it is very clear that, you know, gender is cultural because they are the students that they observed were in process of understanding what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. Okay. Now, this is yeah, this is a pretty clean definition. Things do get a little spicy. And let me well, you already watched the video, so I guess it doesn't get any more spicy. But one thing I like to demonstrate as kind of a clear indication that gender is cultural, not biological, right? Is when you go on a date with somebody, right? Are you checking their body parts? Are you checking any of the criteria that, you know, that might biologically constitute a man or a woman? Not really, right? There might be some indications that says they might have those things, but you're not really checking. So really what you're relying on is appearance. You're relying on people's appearance. And this relates heavily to, well, actually, you know what, we'll talk about at the end. We'll talk about the end, okay? So this is Judith Butler. This is the understanding and definition of gender. This is very different from sex, and we're going to continue on, okay? Now, this is going to be about the gender neutral video. If you have not watched that video, please stop now and go watch that video, okay? So let's get into it. How does this video relate back to culture? How does it reflect on things like multiculturalism and being set of different cultures? So essentially, when you talk about gender, gender is cultural, right? And so when people usually think about culture, as I'm trying to break, you know, from common misunderstanding, they always associate culture with something from, you know, just another part of the another country. But really, as we've learned, it's everything day to day. Now, how does this relate back to culture? It's very straightforward. Being trans, or in this case, being hen, is a different cultural understanding of gender. Okay. Now, what does that mean for multiculturalism in being accepted different cultures? Basically, if you had a certain reaction to this lifestyle, you are pretty much you are being ethnocentric, right? Because essentially what is happening is you are not used to this understanding of gender. And so it, it makes you feel uncomfortable or brings up certain, judgments, whatever. It's fine. But the most important thing that I want to point out is that being multicultural and being accepted in different cultures is not an easy thing. And this is why when people talk about cultural acceptance, every freaking business, every freaking school has something about different cultures and being accepting, and quite honestly, that's not really true. Because what if it's in my culture to be late? Is it okay for me to be late with my work? Is it okay to be late to class and late with my exams? No. So when we're talking about being culturally open, it's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. Now, in reality, there's no major difference between how gender is taught in the video versus how we learn gender in our own society, right? The only difference here is the difference in values, that they value gender neutrality and we value single gender conformity differently. That's it. And you know what's even funnier is that even if you look at the larger scale of Sweden, they are more similar to us in general than not. However, this particular family really values gender neutrality. Okay. Now, the reason why this is exactly the same, right, is at the end. I don't know if you noticed this, but Mappa talked about how people are people criticize Mappa Dell because they are basically pushing, their, gender neutral values onto the kids. And Dell, one of the many responses that I thought was pretty insightful was talking about, well, other parents do that, why can't we? Essentially, people raise children just like them. Now, that is a very interesting statement because when I watch this video, I have a certain reaction. I'm like, you know what? That's probably not good for the kids. I don't think it's giving them any freedom in understanding gender or anything. It's more of just kind of teaching them to be gender neutral. But what's the difference then between my dad teaching me to be a man versus my mom teaching me not to be a woman or whatever those standards are? Do I have the same reaction to another father that smacks the Barbie doll out of his, boy's hand? I don't have the same reaction. It's the simplest answer is because I'm more used to that than I am to the video, right? And so when we think about he or she, right, these definitions of what a boy or a girl is or what a man or woman is, it is actually really, really impactful that we follow this cultural norm because as we can see, it is not necessarily that different in terms of learning gender, but it is different in terms of how many people subscribe to that cultural value, right? So, for example, I would say that most of America subscribes to there's a boy and a girl. And in Sweden, there is a larger group of people that believe that there's boy, girl, and hen. That's the only difference. But because of this small difference, there's a lot of issues, right? There's a lot of cultural judgment from our end because we don't understand how they are, sorry, we are unfamiliar with how they demonstrate gender. And there's probably eventually going to be a lot of misunderstanding on their end as well. Okay. Now, I want to be clear though, right? This particular video is not an anthropological ethnography. Okay. And there's a few pretty easy points that you can tell why it's not. You can tell right away that this video is very biased. It is very much encouraging you to be very accepting of trans people and also painting Sweden in a very progressive light. However, if you look at the entirety of the country, they are more similar to the United States than not in terms of being accepting or not accepting of trans people. Okay. Now, I just want to put that in there just to be clear. Now, one of the more interesting things though, okay, is so you kind of get the general gist, right? Look, when we think about gender, we think about something that is different than other cultures. We think of something that people should do and shouldn't do. But in reality, those things are simply different gender standards for different countries and different cultures. sorry, shouldn't say country, for different cultures, right? Just how in certain countries it is more masculine. It is more important for a man of sorry, it is more masculine for someone to, I don't know, make money than it is to work out. Or it is more or it is not as feminine to have long hair than it is to have short hair, right? These are all just different standards. Now, with Mappa and or Dell, this is the same exact thing, right? They just have a different standard for what is acceptable for their kid, okay, and their family, okay. And that's the main thing I want to point out to you, right? Is that being multiculturally accepting, being accepting every culture is not easy. And if you are to say that you don't like trans stuff, trans people, trans anything, trans rights, then while, you know, people might think of it differently, it's actually not different from discriminating against any other cultural standard. Okay. Now, that's kind of like the more basic takeaway. Now let's get a little deeper. One of the things that students always write is that MAPA is letting their kids Mika and Nico choose. Now, this one is not the point of the video, right? And number two is, I really want to ask you is she, or sorry, are they really letting their kids choose? Not really. They are being taught to be gender neutral or whatever, right? Now, let me ask you a crazy question. Were you given the ability to choose whether you were a boy or girl when you're growing up? No, right? It's a similar situation with them. Okay. So again, I want to circle back and say the way that they are learning gender is the same way that we learn gender as we're growing up. The only difference is we have a lot more things, right? Where is it? We have a lot more repeated acts, right? That the gender neutral, wait, that the gender neutral video does not have. Okay. So keep that in mind, right? More, and and the last thing is when you are thinking about why I'm showing this video. There's a few reasons, and one of the main ones is that, is Mappa really creating, or sorry, really letting their kids choose? No. But what they are doing is they're teaching their kids a different standard for gender, which brings it back to what we're talking about, because it is not any different from us teaching our kids what it is to be a man or woman or whatever. Okay? Keep that in mind. All right? So I hope you find that kind of interesting. Now, it is important to remember that culture is not just the superficial stuff we hear about in articles. It is deeper and much more ingrained in our lives. In this case, it is gender, but if you take a step back, that's how all of our cultures formed, right? So, what's really interesting is that actually, and you might be asking, why are these two, why is it Diablo and Adam and Judith Butler and gender neutral in the same section? Well, it's because it's the same thing. When you are what's it called, judging people off of things such as their appearance, surprise surprise, right, this is a cultural difference. Does that make sense? When you are judging people off of different cultural values, that is a cultural difference, obviously, right? And so when you are disliking someone for their skin color or disliking someone for their gender, they are the same things. Okay. More importantly, which is the big tie to both of them, Judith Butler significantly said or talked about how gender is created. So those repeated acts being done over and over again. That is, okay, hear me out. That is exactly how ethnicity, race, and nationality are created. Literally exactly, right? Because when you look at our standards for certain types of people, we base those standards off of one, our experience with them and our experiences with, that whatever that might be, whether it's their cooking or their food or their appearance or their manners or whatever. That is the exact thing as being used to men should do this or women should be do this. Now, so what's important though is how is gender created? Gender is created through repeated acts done in society, right? That happens so often that people think it's natural instead of it being cultural, right? So if you hear things like certain types of people do these things naturally, that's where it comes from, right? Is it happens so often that people think that people are naturally drawn to this type of thing. Okay. So moving on, this is more of a general takeaway. When people say that they are accepting diversity, what do they really mean? Are they actually accepting cultural differences, or do they just have a different set of cultural values they are willing to accept? To realistically be multicultural and accept other cultures is a difficult task, and most people don't even know that they are being ethnocentric, right? So, basically what this is saying is that it's very difficult to be multicultural, and culturally relativistic. And I hope that this might help you catch yourself. I am not asking you to be, accepting or to understand and love everything. What I'm asking you to understand is how do these things come about, right? Through what so like why did I really show you that Mappa video? That show you my Mappa video because that is how gender is created. You see how they go to certain types of schools, they use certain types of language, they dress them a certain way. These are the ways in which gender norms are created. That is the most important takeaway, right? However, people get really caught up about being whether trans people are, whether they're doing the right thing or are they young enough to be, participating in this, all this other crap. But in reality, the whole purpose of me showing this video, well, one is to get your mind going a little bit. But number two is also, I want you to see how gender is created. Okay. And as you can probably tell, and as probably, well, again, this is not like a live class, so you can't tell, but when it comes to this one, this is a little bit more difficult for people to accept, right? And in order to be, culturally relativistic, be like, okay, I'm gonna do my thing, that's cool. They're gonna do their thing, that's cool. It's not so easy, right? I guarantee you, many of you, if not all of you, have a pretty strong reaction to this video, and it's gonna be ethnocentric or judgy, right? So now this leads to the last point. Ethnocentrism in many ways is inevitable. However, it is important to realize that the differences that exist between people are culturally caused and oftentimes not a reflection of character or intention, right? So what is that trying to say? That says that ethnocentrism is normal, right? It's going to happen. Of course, I do not know everyone's culture in the world. It's impossible, right? However, it's important to realize that when you see these differences between certain people, it is a cultural difference, okay? Meaning that that difference is from them growing up in a different environment and having different standards and so on and so forth. It is not a reflection of them being dumb, uneducated, rude, whatever that extra judgment is, it is not that. And that's really the takeaway here, okay? So I hope you guys found that one. Wow, why is it repeated here? Hope you guys found that these videos a little interesting. I know it probably feels a little rushed because it's a lot of stuff to cover kind of in a short amount of time. But as always, if you have any questions, please shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kbcc.cu.edu. There are so many things in here that are not supposed to be here. All right. Yeah. So again, this is a little more difficult section. So if you have any questions or whatever, please shoot me an email. And other than that, have a nice day.